Before today's video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the latest videos. If you want to see a case or topic covered by Paranormally Listed, then go to criminallylisted.com and fill out the questionnaire under the Suggest a Case tab. Number 3. Dorothy Arnold. On the morning of December 12, 1910, 25-year-old Manhattan socialite Dorothy Arnold left her parents' house in search of a new party dress. On her way to the store, she stopped for candy and popped into a travel agency to ask about steamships heading to Europe. Then she bought a couple of books at a bookstore and happened to bump into an old friend on the sidewalk. After a brief conversation, Dorothy said she was going to cross through Central Park on her way to get her dress. She waved goodbye to her friend before she crossed the street and was never seen again. Dorothy's vanishing created media sensation in New York at the time, but not right away, because her well-to-do family, fearful of being embarrassed by the disappearance, didn't call the police for 6 weeks after the night she failed to come home for dinner. They kept Dorothy's mysterious absence to themselves and hired private detectives from the famed Pinkerton Detective Agency. Unfortunately, that team of gumshoes didn't come back with any good news. The first theory was suicide. It seems in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Dorothy had grown discouraged. Ever since graduating from college, she wanted to become a writer, but in the bedroom fireplace, the detectives found the charred remains of pages of prose Dorothy had set to burn. In her desk, they found rejection slips from several magazines as well. And she was heartbroken too. Dorothy had recently struck up an affair with 42-year-old George Griscom. When her parents found out about it, her father angrily forbade his daughter to see the man again. Roughly 8 weeks before her disappearance, Dorothy told her folks she was going to visit an old classmate in Boston, Massachusetts. But the true purpose of the trip was to meet up with George. Dorothy pawned $500 worth of her family jewels to fund her hotel stay for a week, renting 2 rooms. Presumably, they only used one of those rooms. Then, in late 1910, George left New York for a sudden but extended stay in Italy with his family, and Dorothy was heartbroken. Another theory put forth, especially by Dorothy's dad, Francis, was murder. Mr. Arnold was convinced that his daughter met a tragic end as she crossed Central Park after meeting up with her friend on the sidewalk. He even demanded the detectives comb every inch of the park for clues, and when that was done, he ordered a drag search of the park's large lake for her. But the detectives were growing impatient with Francis and his demands. They had to research the park up and down, and there was no sense dragging the lake. At the time of her disappearance, they were already skating on the frozen lake, so she couldn't be buried under the ice. They implored Francis and Mrs. Arnold to go to the police to help perhaps cast a wider net. Only then, 6 weeks after Dorothy went missing, did Francis agree. After the private detectives gave their information to the police gave it to the media. And what the Arnold family feared would happen, happened. Every newspaper in New York, and there were plenty back then, got in on the game of finding Dorothy Arnold. And when they got the name of George Griscom still staying in Italy, the game was on. The papers followed along as Mrs. Arnold and her son boarded a ship to Europe to confront George about her missing daughter. Once there, she demanded he turn over the letters Dorothy had written to him since he left New York. He did, reluctantly. But the media and the police never saw them. The family inexplicably burned the letters because they thought them of no further value to the case. For his part, George went on the record saying he wanted to marry Dorothy whenever she turned up. And for their part, Dorothy's parents said they would never allow that to happen. That brings up a third theory, which cropped up 6 years after that cool December afternoon in 1910. Accidental death. Did something unexpected happen during Dorothy and George's romance? especially during their Boston rendezvous only a few weeks before her vanishing? Is that why George's family dragged him to Italy so suddenly after their fling? Was this certain something mentioned in Dorothy's letters to George? And is that why her family had the letters burned? Because of the shame that would bring upon the noble Arnold family? Some believe these questions add up. In April 1916, a house in Bellevue, Pennsylvania was raided by police who claimed it was an illegal abortion clinic. In the basement of the house, they found 2 industrial furnaces. A nurse who was arrested at the clinic admitted that when women died on the table, their bodies were burned up in the furnaces. Though Bellevue is 6 hours from Manhattan, did Dorothy Arnold attend a similar kind of clinic in New York, where she met with an untimely end for a procedure gone wrong? No final answer was ever offered by the police or the detectives. The NYPD eventually gave up the search for Dorothy Arnold, and Francis Arnold eventually, reluctantly, gave up his search as well. Before he passed away in 1922, Mr. Arnold estimated that he spent the equivalent of $2.5 million in today's dollars to find his daughter. He had his will revised shortly before his death, and it said, quote, "Made no provision for my beloved daughter, Dorothy, as I am satisfied she is not alive," unquote. Perhaps meaning Francis Arnold knew something that no one else did. Number 2. The Sodder Children. It is a sad fact of history that household fires on Christmas Eve were a much too common tragedy in the mid-20th century. Something about faulty Christmas lights, tipped over candles, or crackling fireplaces, perhaps. But one Christmas Eve fire has been shrouded in mystery ever since it happened in 1945. On that night, George and Jenny Sodder tucked in their 9 children with visions of sugar plums dancing in their heads. A couple of hours later, Jenny went downstairs to answer the phone in George's office, but it was a wrong number. Sometime after that, Jenny heard a loud clang on the tin roof above her bedroom. Figuring it was an animal or something, she went back to sleep. Moments later, however, the family was awoken by smoke that filled the upstairs hallway. George and Jenny fled the house with 4 other 9 children. While Jenny ran to the neighbor's house to call the fire department, George tried to go back inside for his other children. Unfortunately, the fire had grown too large. By the time firefighters arrived, the smoldering ruins of the family's 2-story home were nothing but a pile of ashes on the basement floor. With hat in hand, an official from Fayetteville, West Virginia, told the Sodders their remaining children had likely been cremated in the blaze. Death certificates were issued for Maurice, age 15, Martha Lee, age 12, Louis, age 9, Jenny, age 8, and Betty, who was 6 years old. But were they really dead? George and Jenny Sodder began to think maybe not. What the parents believed their children was alive wasn't some kind of grief denial stage. They may have been onto something. George Sodder was a well-respected local citizen, but that doesn't necessarily mean he was well-liked. As an Italian immigrant, he often spoke out against Italy's fascist leader, Mussolini, a point of view not shared by many of the other Italian Americans in his town. Once he got into a heated political argument with an insurance salesman, an Italian himself, who warned that someday George's house might go up in smoke. George was also involved in the coal trucking business, a line of work that fell under the purview of the Italian mafia in other cities around America at the time. Jenny did some digging of her own. When a local coroner explained to her that house fires don't reach a temperature hot enough to fully cremate a human body, she did some experimenting. She filled a bonfire with animal bones and set a light to see if they burned up to ash. They did not. What about the wrong number phone call she received hours before the fire, or the thump on the roof that night? Also, when the house was inspected, it turned out that the phone lines had been cut. Who had cut the phone lines, and why? Furthermore, Why had a ladder George kept alongside the house for fire escapes been moved 75 feet and placed in a culvert? Amazingly, George and Jenny patiently sifted through the remains of their house and soon found 4 vertebrae. And when the authorities refused to test them, having decided the case was closed, the Sodders sent them to the Smithsonian Institution. Scientists there determined the bones were consistent with young children. But the bones were clean and bright white, and had no signs of burning or charring, and the Smithsonian's report also stated it was very strange that no other bones were found in the excavation of the basement of the house. Where was the rest of the children's remains? Unable to get anyone to listen to their theory, their children were, in fact, kidnapped from their house before the fire. The Sodders set up a billboard along Route 16 in West Virginia, offering cash for any information. Tips came in, no doubt angling for the family's $10,000 reward. One person swore they saw the 4 Sodder children at a motel on Christmas Day of that year with 2 men and 2 women. Later, the Sodders received a picture postcard from someone claiming to be their son, Louis. Jenny believed the man in the photo bore a resemblance to her son, but she was never able to find out who he was. George Sodder died in 1969, still hoping for a break in the case, after making it his life's work to correct any misinformation published about his family story. He went to his grave firmly believing his kids had been taken as some kind of retribution for his past deeds or beliefs, and that his home was set aflame to cover it up. Jenny Sodder maintained that reward billboard along Route 16, along with a memorial garden to her 5 missing children, all the way up to her death in 1989, after which the billboard also mysteriously disappeared. In the years after her mother's passing, Sylvia Sodder, who was 3.5 at the time of the fire, took up the mantle in her family's hunt for answers. For many years, she's maintained a website with case files and tips for amateur detectives to pore over. Sadly, Sylvia passed away in 2021, never having seen the mystery of her missing siblings resolved. Number 1. Dora Forstein. It was a typical Tuesday morning in October 1949. 43-year-old Jules Forstein picked up his briefcase, kissed his wife Dora and their 3 children, and headed off to work at City Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. After her husband left, however, Dora spent the next 10 minutes going around the house to check and recheck the many locks on their doors and windows. She wasn't suffering from OCD though, she was suffering from PTSD, and rightly so. 4.5 years earlier, after coming home from a day of shopping, Dora was beaten to within an inch of her life on the front steps of her home. The attacker had waited under the porch for Dora and then savagely gave her a broken jaw, fractured clavicle, dislocated shoulder, and a serious concussion. The fact that she managed to dial the operator before passing out may have saved her life. Given that whoever beat Dora left her purse untouched, the cops quickly ruled out robbery, but they speculated it might have been revenge for one of her husband's decisions. Jules Forstein was a magistrate, which is essentially a judge who makes low-level decisions on bylaws and city ordinances. A person doesn't have to hold a law degree to get elected to a magistrate position, however, and the cops suspected that someone took offense to this particular quirk of city politics. A revenge for one of Jules's decisions, or perhaps to send a message about an upcoming one, they beat up his wife and left her for dead. So Dora Forstein had a good reason to be overly cautious that day in October. Unfortunately, her caution didn't help her in the end. Around 8:30 p.m., Jules called home to apologize to his wife. He was running late at a political fundraiser. He knew that she didn't like being alone for long stretches, but it couldn't be helped. Dora brushed it off, telling her husband she and the kids were just fine. Their teenage daughter, Myrna, was staying at a friend's house, while 9-year-old Marcy and 5-year-old Eddie were already in bed. She told him to enjoy himself. "Be sure to miss me," she joked before hanging up. Those were the last words someone ever heard Dora say. When Jules eventually came home at 11:30, he unlocked the front door with his 2 keys. As he put his briefcase in the corner, he tried to stay quiet. But as he headed upstairs to bed, he heard whimpering from his daughter's bedroom. Jules was horrified to find Marcy and little Eddie crying and hugging each other in the corner. They were unharmed, but they were terrified. "Mommy's gone," Marcy cried. Throwing open his bedroom door, Jules found the bed was unmade, and his wife was nowhere to be found. Jules checked with the neighbors and made calls to Dora's friends. No one had seen her, though Dora did call a friend at 9:30 p.m. to make plans for the next day. Jules' next call was to his friend, Philadelphia Police Captain Jim Kelly. Officers from the Philly PD went to hospitals, psych wards, and even the morgue in search of Dorothy Forstein. Meanwhile, Captain Kelly searched the house for clues. Dora's purse and keys were left untouched. Her clothes were folded neatly, indicating she had been wearing her night clothes. Jules wondered if his wife had some kind of fugue episode from her previous head trauma. Had she been suffering from amnesia when she wandered away from the home, or had she planned to disappear, given her coy response to his call that evening? "Don't forget to miss me," she told him. A check at the bank revealed she hadn't made any recent withdrawals. Her purse was left behind. How far could she get with no money? What about the front door, which was locked and deadbolted? Jules used his keys to get in, while Dora's keys were still in the bedroom. Who locked the door on the way out? Captain Kelly sat the children down and asked Marcy if she locked the door when she found out her mother wasn't home. Marcy said she hadn't, but then, to everyone's utter shock, she began to relate a terrifying story. The girl said she had been woken up in the night by the sound of footsteps. She got up and went to the hallway. That's when she saw a man coming up the stairs. The man saw Marcy, but ignored her as he went into her mother's bedroom. When the door opened, Marcy saw her mother was face down on the floor. She watched the man roll her mother over, lift her up, putting the 125-pound woman over his shoulder like a sack of flour. Then he headed back down the hallway. As he passed Marcy, he patted her head and told her that her mummy was sick, but she'd be alright soon enough. She was wearing her silk red pajamas, Marcy told the police, the ones she thinks are pretty. Then the man carried her mother down the stairs and through the front door. After he left, Marcy said she could hear the door lock click into place. That's when she woke up Eddie and waited for him until their daddy came home. Marcy's description of her mother's possible abductor made headlines in Philly the next day. All-point bulletins went out with Marcy's scant description of the man. About 40 years old, daddy's age, she said, wearing a tan-colored cap and a brown jacket. A $1,000 reward was offered for information on the man or the whereabouts of Dora. For his part, Captain Kelly couldn't make sense of the lack of evidence regarding this mysterious stranger. No fingerprints on the banister, though Marcy said he wasn't wearing gloves. How did he let himself in the locked door? For that matter, how had he locked the door behind him? Why were there no witnesses on the street who saw a man carrying a woman over his shoulder? It was only about 10:30 p.m., and there were people still awake at that hour, but no one saw anything. 3 days after Dora's disappearance, Captain Kelly told the media there were no new leads in the case. The search was then expanded to cities up and down the East Coast. But Dora Forstein was never found. The police eventually told the papers that Marcy's story about the intruder had probably been a tall tale after all, because it just didn't add up. Dora's family, meanwhile, told the paper that she had many friends and absolutely no enemies. Jules Forstein, on the other hand, never came forward with a list of his many political and criminal enemies. 4 months before his wife's disappearance, the magistrate had levied a hefty fine against former lightweight boxer Bob Montgomery for a numbers-running racket. In 1949, illegal lottery operations, along with boxing, were largely overseen by the mob. In January 1956, Jules Forstein was found dead in his bed of an apparent heart attack at the age of 49. 10 months later, 7 years to the day of her disappearance, Dora Forstein was legally declared dead by the state of Pennsylvania. She had missed her eldest daughter Myrna's wedding in the ensuing years. It was Myrna who legally adopted Marcy and Eddie after her parents' death. None of them ever knowing what had happened to their mother and never forgetting to miss her. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. We also have a podcast about cold cases that were eventually solved called Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. You can find it on Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.